Morning, everyone, and welcome to your morning report for the 11th of March, 2026. Let's get to our executive summary. If you could come on, Jared. Inside the Beltway, more DC-based activists are holding jury nullification training, including for grand juries. House Speaker Mike Johnson believes the Republican Party can grow its majority in Congress this year and defy history, in his own words. Over the domestic side, the DHS shutdown is now starting to impact air travel this past week as TSA agents missed their first full paycheck this Friday. The first U.S. fuel refinery is set to begin in 50 years is set to begin construction in Brownsville, Texas. And the White House is urging deportation message discipline to the Republican Party.
All right. Over on the global side, the most important trend here is that the Iran war is shifting to words and actions around renewing shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. We've covered that pretty extensively. The U.S. military is preparing options for escorts through the strait, while shipping industry the shipping industry continues to voice concerns about the risks associated to it.
Looking forward, the far left, I think, is going to continue to broaden coalitions with an eye toward large economic actions in the future. The far left participants in the anti-ICE organized resistance have declared victory in Operation Metro Surge publicly, while amongst themselves and in some of these far left report backs, they are reporting burnout and disbelief that Operation Metro Surge ended, because they have reported another increase in ICE enforcement actions this week, and enforcement operations do continue nationwide. The far left, I think, likely sees economic actions as more impactful, and they're attempting to leverage these activist networks that they've built in the ICE resistance to increase the impact of these planned economic actions in the future.
Yep. And we've got actually a lot of items today that are covering covering oil and gas, and the lack of shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, I think, is driving up energy prices, and they meet it near term. But there's a new refinery opening up and new extraction deals coming out of Venezuela that I think indicate long-term stabilization of the price.
All right, thank you for that, Jared. Let's move on to Inside the Beltway. There's this other activist group, Free DC, their juror information project we've covered over the last couple of months. A new activist group called Freedom Trainers is holding jury nullification training for activists in Washington, D.C. and across the U.S. So I took a look at their website, and they say that they teach people the proven tools of, quote, collective non-cooperation and nonviolent resistance. And these are strategies that Freedom Trainers says have toppled authoritarian regimes around the world. One of the founders of this group is also the executive director of the Free DC Project, which has been conducting its own juror information project training sessions since last summer. The goal here is clearly to jam up criminal prosecutions by the Trump administration, with the objective of undermining the Trump administration's legitimacy. Activists, I looked through they released a slide book, like these zines and guides that were coming out of the anti-ICE organized resistance, and they are clearly aware of the gray area that jury nullification exists in, and they are weaponizing that gray area. Looking through the slides, they advise people who are being trained and through both directly the Freedom Trainers trainers, but also other groups that have taken their slide book and conducted their own training, to surreptitiously get onto juries, not mention any of this, but then to engage it effectively in jury nullification, regardless of what the case is, if it's being brought by the Trump administration. And like other zines and guides that have been coming out of the anti-ICE organized resistance, I think this slide book and these pamphlets are likely to act as a force multiplier for collective non-cooperation. Moving over to the DoD, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth pressed DoD civilian managers to encourage their civilian defense employees to volunteer for a detail supporting immigration enforcement operations. These are 180-day details, and they include logistics support, operational planning, and data entry. This memo is from February, but was not sent until Monday. And according to that memo, the Department of Homeland Security needs volunteers due to, quote, the potential for increased numbers of migrants in the interior of the United States territory and across the southwest border. That's an interesting statement in the memo, because the Trump administration has effectively shut down the border and has been conducting interior removals, and maybe an indicator that the Trump administration is expecting some type of surge coming from Latin America. But this is an indicator that the Trump administration is continuing immigration enforcement operations despite the DHS shutdown and despite this messaging discipline that Republicans are apparently being urged to engage in. And also over at the Republican Party, House Speaker Mike Johnson said Republicans will, quote, defy history and grow their congressional majority in the 2026 election. This was at the Doral, Florida meeting of Republicans this week. And in there was a panel that included House Majority Whip Tom Emmer, who's a Minnesota Republican. He said President Trump is going to campaign to drive low and mid propensity voters to the polls in November. The base case remains that Democrats are likely to flip at least a House in the 2026 midterm. They're facing a much more difficult Senate map, but there are about 24 seats that seem to be up for grabs. However, there is case-specific evidence which could point to Democrats underperforming in the midterm, and this case-specific evidence will become more important the closer we get to November. There's recent opinion polling that shows Democrats below the GOP, including with their own voters, that fewer self-identified Democrat voters view the Democratic Party favorably than GOP voters view the Republican Party. They've also been facing this partisan registration crisis. And I will say, though, that there is a Gallup poll that shows more independents and you have more people who are identifying as independent as as they have in a long time now. I think they said going back, this is as many people are identifying as independents this year as they did, or not to the levels that they've seen since 2011. But further, they asked them, which way they lean, and there's been a slight shift in self-identified independent voters leaning Democrat. So that does seem to be in their favor. I think as we get closer to November, the Republicans' ability to hold onto the House will likely come down to President Trump driving those low and mid propensity voters to the polls in the general election. Because we've seen this shift. There used to be that Republican voters were more likely to turn out for midterm elections and Democrat voters were less likely to turn out. And in the last few election cycles, that has shifted significantly, where Democrat voters are actually more likely to turn out for both midterms and special elections, and Republican voters are less likely to turn out. And part of this has been the phenomena of low and mid propensity voters who turn out for Trump. And it looks like the Republican Party is banking on that happening again this year. Moving over to the domestic side, airports in Louisiana, Texas, and Georgia warned that travelers should expect longer than normal wait times due to the impact of the DHS shutdown. TSA employees are going to miss their first full paycheck this week, and the TSA union said that some employees are already seeking other employment to make up for that pay shortfall. I've seen that air travel industry lobbyists have been putting more pressure on lawmakers to pass DHS funding due to the ongoing travel disruptions at some of these airports and expected disruptions at future expected disruptions. And one of the areas that has not been disrupted is air traffic controllers, because they are funded through the Department of Transportation. So it seems like that's why this has taken longer for airports to start seeing an impact from the DHS shutdown, as we saw last year when there was a full government shutdown that included the Department of Transportation. The disruptions to travel didn't take as long for travelers to experience. I think we're likely to see more or an increase in these travel disruptions as the DHS shutdown continues. I have not seen any indicators from the Democrats that they're willing to deal. However, as travel disruptions increase, this will put more pressure on Congress to make a deal on DHS funding. So we could see something happen between Republicans and Democrats to get at least some moderate Democrats across the aisle and vote to fund DHS. President Donald Trump announced yesterday that America First Refining is going to begin construction on the first new U.S. oil refinery in 50 years, and it's going to be located in Brownsville, Texas. Construction set to begin in the second quarter of this year, and this refinery is expected to process 160,000 barrels of shale oil per day. They're also the company America First Refining is also in investment talks with Indian energy giant Reliance and has already signed a 20-year deal to sell fuel to that Indian energy company. Refining capacity remains a significant supply chain vulnerability for the United States, not just in energy, but also in rare earth metals. That's been the key piece that the United States is missing when it comes to supply chain security. The Trump administration has been or has attempted to expedite permitting for new energy projects basically since day one. And I expect this is one of the areas that the Trump administration is going to focus on, because I imagine there are very smart people working for the federal government telling the Trump administration, telling the White House that refining capacity is a major vulnerability. Over in Chicago, there appears to be no sign of this expected spring resurgence of Operation Midway Blitz. And this is according to federal data reviewed by the Chicago Sun-Times. They said the DHS has not made any major purchases of supplies, ammunition, or relocation services for ICE agents in Illinois, because there was a source that told them in November, and at the time, Commander Greg Bovino said that they were going to resurge into Chicago in the spring. And that has not materialized. A former DHS official said that DHS leaders were also told to prioritize target enforcement over street sweeps, or what he called street sweeps. But this official said it does not appear that ICE is planning to stop immigration enforcement because they are ramping up all the other parts of the system. One of the other reliable indicators that I've seen for an imminent surge is activist reports of ICE and CBP staging assets on the ground. And this has been a pretty reliable indicator for imminent enforcement actions. And there have been no reports that I've seen from activists on the ground in Chicago that any federal assets or personnel are being staged around Chicago or any other parts of Illinois. DHS is, as we've previously reported, I think unlikely to launch any large named operations in the short term. There's been this shift to, or DHS reportedly was planning to shift to a strategy of smaller, persistent enforcement operations nationwide. And I think this is likely to avoid giving the anti-ICE organized resistance a large target for direct action demonstrations. On the tactical level or operational level, they have been doing this in Minneapolis. Activists reported that they've switched from a more overt footprint to a more covert footprint, where they are conducting smaller footprint operations with a smaller amount of agents, with the idea that they can get in and out of an enforcement operation before the anti-ICE rapid response groups can show up and conduct direct action demonstrations and de-arrest attempts. I think the ongoing DHS shutdown is also likely a factor in what looks like a pause in these large surge operations. So I wouldn't expect any larger enforcement operations, especially on the scale of Operation Metro Surge, to occur until after the DHS shutdown is ended. White House, so at that Republican meeting in Doral, Florida, White House Deputy Chief of Staff James Blair, according to Axios sources, privately urged House Republicans to stop emphasizing mass deportations and focus their messaging on removing criminal illegal aliens. This is not really a change, frankly. The Trump administration has emphasized deportations of the worst for the last year, but ICE statistics coming out of ICE for arrests and removals from last year point to the administration conducting deportations more broadly, not just focusing on the worst. I think this is purely a messaging strategy. And I think the Trump administration is likely to continue emphasizing their public messaging on removing the worst while continuing aggressive enforcement operations. And then finally, over in San Francisco, some San Francisco-based activist groups, which include Indivisible San Francisco, East Bay Democratic Socialists of America, Mayday Strong, and a coalition of other activist and union groups plan to hold a training event on the 14th of March, and they're calling it Train for Mass Disruption, Mayday and Beyond, Stop Fascism and ICE Attacks. They said they're going to apply lessons learned from the anti-ICE organized resistance in Minnesota, Illinois, and these other federal surges, and are planning for mass resistance on May Day. That there is an effort from the far left, and this includes the DSA is really at the center of this, especially the Twin Cities DSA in Minneapolis and St. Paul. They've been emphasizing these economic blackouts, economic days of action, and they are, many of them, likely pushing for a general strike on May Day of this year. I think that likely is going to be another structure test, basically to see where they are when it comes to the amount of support they have and how many people they can turn out for an economic day of action. I don't expect it to be an actual general strike, to be a successful actual general strike, which is, a nationwide walkout, workplace walkout, school walkout, and a effectively a boycott. I don't expect it to be on that scale, especially for this year, but they do have an eye toward May Day 2028. And this has been pushed for a long time by UAW President Sean Fain. And a lot of these groups, they have said that they don't think they have, the body politic. The normal American doesn't have the political education to understand what a general strike actually looks like. And a lot of these groups, including Twin Cities DSA and some of the union groups they're working with in Minnesota, their goal is not only to test the level of support they have, but also to start spreading out the idea of a general strike and setting up these worker committees in both union and non-union workplaces, and the strike committees in schools and universities. So this is an effort building toward a general strike in the future. All right, Jared, if you could come on and take us through the global SITREP, please.
Yep. All right, we're going to start off in the Middle East, as we do. The U.S. Central Command reported yesterday that the U.S. had destroyed 16 mine layers near the Strait of Hormuz as of yesterday. Now, the U.S. here is destroying Iran's ability to mine the Straits of Hormuz, amongst many other things. The the mine-laying ship pictured here is actually also an anti-ship missile shooter, which means that it's not just about mines; it's about removing threats to shipping all the way deep into the Persian Gulf, up as far as up near Kuwait. Now, this will allow the United States to assign the littoral combat ships that are in the Persian Gulf to a mine countermeasures mission, which is their primary mission in the Persian Gulf as well. Now, basically, this will allow them to actually address the issue without having another ship come back by and lay a new mine. This will rebuild confidence in the shipping industry, or at least it is intended to. As far as the outlook, I think the shipping industry is, as we've discussed here on the show, largely constrained by their fear more than the actual remaining capabilities of the United States, or of the Iranian Navy. Iran's likely to continue to push rumors of a mine strait, even if they never actually do lay a single mine, because you cannot see them until it's far too late, in order to maintain leverage over the situation, regardless of whether or not they've actually laid a single mine. Additionally, there was a report coming from Inside Commodities that, speaking to anonymous sources, they claim that the U.S. Navy has denied requests for shipping due to the risk of attacks being too high for now. This doesn't match what the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff was saying just yesterday, which is that he was preparing options for the president and the Secretary of Defense to assign ships for escort missions. I've seen quite a few people talking about, oh, well, we are looking for the concept of an idea of a plan, or just being dismissive rather than listening to what he's saying, which is saying that he's setting the military conditions and making sure that the threats are properly assessed for an escort mission, and then assigning the appropriate units to conduct one. Over much closer to home, anonymous sources speaking to Reuters on the Chevron and Shell deals with Venezuela say that they're actually coming close to concluding them in order to develop the oil fields in Venezuela. Chevron's focus is going to remain on the extra heavy crude oil that they have been pumping for quite some time, but expanding that, while Shell is actually going to target the few areas that produce light and medium crude oil, as well as natural gas for Venezuela. Over in Asia and the Asian Pacific, a Taiwanese official speaking to state media said that Taiwan is going to have the densest anti-ship missile network anywhere in the world, with 1,400 anti-ship missiles total this year. Now, This is currently 4 times the amount of missiles in Taiwan as China's People's Liberation Army Navy actually has surface combatants. When taken in view of the other defensive capabilities the Taiwanese are procuring or making, this allows Taiwan to assign an overwhelming amount of anti-ship missiles per Chinese ship while still taking some losses to their own equipment. And this notably does not even account for any kind of regional allied involvement like Japan, the Philippines, or the United States, which would significantly improve Taiwan's position. Now, for China to actually succeed in the blockade, they would need to preemptively strike Taiwan's launchers, their missile stockpiles, their pre-positioned batteries, their targeting equipment, similar to what we're seeing in Operation Epic Fury. Now, while China technically is capable of that feat, it doesn't work with their image of being a peacekeeper or for this to be a brotherly reunification operation. And I think that makes their preemptive strike operation less likely, allowing the battery of missiles to be considerably more effective here and driving down the likelihood of Chinese success as well. And lastly, the Japanese Prime Minister, Sanae Takaishi, and her government are expecting President Trump to request Japanese support in the Middle East on her 19 March meeting with him. That'll happen in the United States. The Japanese administration is also considering whether the situation in the Strait of Hormuz meets their rules for providing escorts. Basically, this is a survival threatening situation. Right now, they are assessing it as no, but it may meet the lower threshold requiring them to actually provide logistic support to U.S. vessels in the area.
All right, thank you for that, Jared. Let's move on to questions and answers. If you could pull up our first question for us, Jared, please. Did Iran hit one of our ships?
So I asked Mr. Mike Tarkington here about whether he meant a U.S. flagged vessel or a U.S. Navy ship. He was saying U.S. Navy. And the answer is no, not that I have seen. That's not something that's easily hidden. Just you look at the Stark, the Cole, the Forrestal. A major ship fire does not get hidden easily. And in particular, when it comes to Iran, they're going to publish that absolutely everywhere. They need to save some face. They need to actually score a win. Frankly, I don't think it has happened. I don't think it is going to happen either.
And then I saw another question that came in early in the show. Did someone drive through the barricade at the White House? I did go take a look as soon as I saw that question, and apparently early this morning someone did crash into a gate at the White House, but Secret Services said they don't have a motive. They're still investigating, and they've not released the identity of the driver. So it's possible this was just a traffic accident, but we're waiting for more information. All right, and then from William Lyerly, California and Colorado have passed bipartisan laws requiring age verification for setting up a user account for any internet-connected operating system. For Linux vendors, this is where someone 11 comments. Well, I have seen some commentary that there's basically a bipartisan effort to de-anonymize the internet. I wouldn't be surprised if that's true, that this is part of a larger effort to de-anonymize internet use. That's the really the only ostensible goal I think can be met. There's been a big push for age verification for other things like social media and pornography, but which ostensibly has other objectives, especially when it comes to minors' use of the internet. But when you're talking age verification just for using the internet, I think it's clear. I think it's likely that this is basically an effort to de-anonymize internet use inside the United States. Next question, please. From Frozen Nomad, should a large-scale general strike gain traction, how would you expect the current administration to react and respond? I think that'd be pretty unprecedented. There's not been, they are organizing with an eye toward the future, building that capacity, expanding the coalition of groups to engage in this general strike. Like I've seen a lot of talk from like the far left, different individuals and groups in their own blogs and report backs of, they still view like the nonprofit, the kind of groups that are engaging in like the No Kings protest with a little bit of suspicion. In some cases, they perceive it as they are beholden to their billionaire donors. But they are trying to expand that coalition. And I think because obviously they look at the numbers that Indivisible and 5051 have gotten out for these No Kings protests. Even if you assume that they are exaggerating their turnout, I think in the last one they said they said we got 7 million people to turn out. Even if that is an exaggeration and it's only half of that or a third of that, that is still a lot of people to turn out for a protest. So they're trying to, I think, leverage that ability for them to turn out potentially, 2, 3 million people, and the organizing experience that comes with that. That's a big part of this. So like people will, I think, underestimate the value of having these large protest actions because it's giving activists invaluable experience at organizing large groups of people toward a political objective. As far as the likelihood of success of actually holding a full general strike, I think that's a low likelihood. But the 2028 attempt at a May Day general strike, if the far left continues on their organizing path, could be significant, much larger than any attempt will be this year. And that will give them invaluable experience, political experience, in building and coalition building, organizing large groups of people toward a political action, and also build their capacity for other political actions other than strikes or economic days of action. This is something we saw with the anti-organized resistance. They would hold protests, the PSL, the Party for Socialism and Liberation, some of these other far left groups would participate as well. They would hold these protests with the idea of converting some of those casual protesters, because there are more people more likely to show up for protests, and convert them to activists. So they would expand their activist capacity, and it was part of this casual protester to activist to militant pipeline. And it also it did two things for the anti-organized resistance activists and the far left. It gave them experience in driving turnout, building a crowd, and then converting some portion of that crowd to other political actions. And this is a big advantage that the left broadly has when it comes to political actions is the ability to build a crowd around a single issue, but then leverage that crowd for other issues, intersectionality. And that's what they mean by intersectionality, is being able to take a crowd of protesters that have been converted to activists on one issue, immigration, and put that together with a crowd on economic actions and utilize that added capacity. And the administration's response, I'm not sure. I couldn't tell you because I am not sure they are concerned about a general strike. I have not seen any kind of talk about response to that coming out of the administration. They've also been very tight-lipped in general. They've run a much more tight ship than the first Trump administration. So a lot of inside view is not available because there are fewer leaks coming out of the White House than there were in 2017 to 2021. All right, next question, please, Jared. Carl M., is it true that the USD commissioned the minesweepers, and if so, what alternative method do we have?
Okay. Yes, it is true. They were almost 40 years old. They were kind of falling apart. The alternative is the littoral combat ships that I mentioned earlier. Now, I know that's gonna set off a lot of red flags for people because the LCSs have a terrible reputation. The LCSs in the recent years seem to have been specialized based on the hulls, not hulls for specific missions. So the three that are stationed in the Persian Gulf, they are actually dedicated mine countermeasure ships at this point. They do have obviously some other capabilities, but their primary mission is there to eradicate mines. It's not a 1-for-1 replacement, but it is at least a capability. And with that will come the minemen that specialize in mine countermeasures and mine laying personnel on those ships. So Yeah, I wouldn't say we have zero capability there. It's probably like close 90, if not close to 100% of the capability as the old Minesweepers.
All right. From Griseo Nema, what would the effects be if China still tries to take Taiwan in 2027 and fails?
Well, that depends largely on how true some of the rumors coming out of China are on its internal legitimacy. At the very least, I would expect a leadership change. There are rumors coming from Chinese language media that if the Taiwan operation were to fail, the party would fail, meaning functionally a regime change, not led by the United States, but just people would have lost complete faith in China, and that historically has happened within China. So it's not. I don't think it's totally unreasonable to think that that could actually be on the table. It's just that they maintain such a tight information sphere on what's actually happening inside the party. It is hard to get a very good read on it. And anybody who tells you they've got a good read on it, you should question.
All right. Next question, please, Jared. From Bad Wabbit, how do you think the midterms are shaping up and how the turnout will be? And I think there's a continuation. Also, the House, Senate, do you still believe we will lose one or the other of those entities? Well, when I say the base rate case, that's just based on historical outcomes. The party in power usually loses control of one or both chambers of Congress in the first midterm of their current administration or their current term. Right now, I still think that's the base case. Democrats, from historical trends, have the advantage going into the 2026 election. However, I will caveat that with one of the trends that has been happening long term is basically a tightening of the majorities. So I don't think a lot of people know this, but Republicans didn't hold the House for like 50 years, basically, from like the mid 50s until 1994. The Republicans didn't have a House majority. And it was not an insignificant number of seats the Democrats had, a majority behind the House. But since then, there has been a tightening of that majority down to, in this case, 5 seats right now that the Republicans have on paper over the Democrats in the House. The Senate majority is also significantly tightened, and I think that is going to play a role here in how midterm elections, how congressional elections look going forward. The shifts, I think, between majorities are going to be much smaller, and because of the small number of seats that are being fought over, as far as the majority goes, I think it's difficult to say right now that Democrats are guaranteed to take the House in this year's elections. There are, as I said before, there's some case specific evidence that is against Democrats taking the House. They are, they're facing that partisan registration crisis that they outlined last year. They are significantly behind Republicans in fundraising. The DNC has less than $20 million on hand, and Republicans have just been fundraising like crazy ahead of the midterms. So some more of that will be that case specific evidence will become more important the closer we get to the election. But right now, I would say it's safer to assume that the base case is more accurate. The outside view is more accurate right now, that Democrats are going to flip the House. The Senate map they're facing is much more difficult. I think the Republicans are more likely to hold on to the Senate than the House this year. All right, next question, please. From Griseo Nemo, has there been an update on that list of stuff we depend on China for?
No, I know there was quite a bit of work going into that, but quite a few other things have also shown up that have taken away our attention. And one thing to keep in mind is that it's kind of just everything because of how China has positioned itself over the last few decades. Basically, if they can't control an end product, they will try to control a raw product. So get the ore for refining. Or if they can't control that, then they'll try to find a midstream bottleneck and control that. That way, their hand is in every single pot, and they can always shut off any particular item that they want.
Yeah, and you're talking like a huge, just a swath of different things, ranging from automotive parts to textiles, medicines, which is something that the federal government has been aware of for a while now, is that there is a major supply chain vulnerability. I haven't seen any updates since last year, but there was talk among the pharmaceutical multinationals of moving more production back to the U.S. I just haven't seen an update on it. A lot of reindustrialization stuff takes time, and we're now in month 3 of the second year of Trump's current term. So I would expect that there is pressure on manufacturers to bring back manufacturing to the U.S. We've seen it from the automotive industry, from pharmaceuticals and medical manufacturing. But I think there's also a lot of uncertainty that's going on among the reindustrialization push, and this was happening with tariffs too. Basically, a lot of businesses were saying that they're worried about uncertainty about how the tariffs are going to work out. What they really mean is uncertainty about who's going to be in the White House in 2029, because if it's not JD Vance, then they are not certain that a Democratic administration wouldn't just reverse the push for reshoring manufacturing and tariffs. All right, next question, please. From Ernie Cooper, should the U.S. limiter drop some of their current allies? Some of them seem wishy-washy or more of a burden for us than anything.
Okay, right off the bat, should is a policy request. We do not do that here, but I will say that I do not think it is likely that we are going to drop any allies, even though we have seen the limitation of allies already. That obviously the hot button one is Israel. I think it's unavoidable to say that the U.S. under this administration has limited them to some degree after seeing the reaction to the Qatar strike. They upgrading Qatar to basically a mutual defense treaty is a limitation on what Israel could do there. There are other allies I don't see any limitations on, and I don't see the administration taking any steps to limit them. You look at Japan, I mean, basically the only limit is, hey, don't get nukes. Otherwise, do whatever you want to do.
Well, there's also other considerations too. Like when he's talking about wishy-washy, I think he means like Canada and Europe. Yeah. The United States has other reasons not to drop them as allies, and the indicators I see is that they're not going to, like the national security strategy. It had some criticisms for European leaders, but there were no indicators in there that the U.S. was planning to basically back out of European influence. And I don't think that's likely. Europe is a major strategic ally. Canada is important because we share a border with them. Yeah. So that is important for our national security. I don't see the Trump administration dropping Canada as an ally just for that reason, because that would likely result in some other larger power coming in and trying to woo them as a middle power.
Yeah, just for homeland defense, I realize not in governmental terms, but when speaking only on homeland defense, Canada is functionally part of the United States. Like they are half of NORAD. That not going to give it up there. And if anything, it looks like the U.S. is trying to kind of expand its allies when you look at the coverage that we've given over the Latin American operations. That to me, it's not going to be NATO or anything close to that. But let's not kid ourselves. That is expanding the U.S.'s security partners throughout the region and making them more reliant on U.S. technology and training. That's an expansion of allies, not a limitation.
All right. Next question, please, Jared. From Bad Wabbit, what is the status of the chip manufacturing industry inside of the United States?
It's been a while since I've seen an update on that, particularly from Taiwan. That's really, really the big one that matters there. But I did see that there were a couple, what was it? I think it was in spring, maybe early summer of last year, that the Arizona fab had actually basically developed its own higher end chips independent of the Taiwanese. Uh, Honestly, that's going to be a slow moving thing. Just there are going to be very hard limits on how small you can get these things and have them still be functional. And we're already in the nanometer spectrum. They're tiny. Additionally, as Taiwan focuses more on uh, war preparations and not chip development, you're going to see less innovation there, and the U.S. plants from Taiwan will always, per Taiwanese law, be one generation behind. So without any new developments coming out of Taiwan, there's not guaranteed to be anything coming out of the United States. Just one generation behind for us.
Well, there's also been, so I have seen that some other planned chip production projects have been disrupted by environmentalist groups. That is one update I have seen in the last couple of months, that there are these groups using U.S. environmental laws to at least get a pause on the construction of these projects. I'm not sure how that's going to end up, in the end, how that's going to impact the expansion of chip production. But there is an effort to disrupt that. And I've seen arguments that there is likely some foreign influence there. I would not be surprised to find that out, that there is some foreign influence trying to disrupt U.S. Development of chip production. Next question, please. From Ben T. Roughly 20% of voters bothered to turn out for the recent primary elections compared to about 40% in the 70s. What accounts for the dramatic increase in voter apathy? We actually talked about this in 2023. There was a lot of opinion polling coming out that people, especially Republicans, but this was even happening among self-identified Democrats, there was a loss of faith in elections, especially after the 2020 election. And that could be part of it, why we're seeing lower turnout. And it is especially among Republicans, a feeling that the Republican Party is not acting like they are representative of their voters. That is I think a possible explanation for why we're seeing less like a lower level of turnout in general, but especially among Republicans, and why there's such a reliance on low and mid propensity voters, and why the Trump administration is taking a much more active role in trying to drive turnout in the 2026 election. Because there is a shift of more politically activated voters to the Democratic Party, or their voters are becoming more activated and more active in primaries and special elections. And Republicans' turnout has been depressed, and they're now becoming really or at least the MAGA part of the party has become reliant on those low and mid propensity voters that feel like they aren't being represented. Next question, please. From Bad Wabbit, do we have a map list of those in the House up for election and those in the Senate? I'm sure we've published a map, but I will get a new updated map, because there have been some changes. Like, there have been more Republicans announcing that more Democrats announcing they're not going to seek re-election in the 2026 election, or they're looking at running for other offices like governor or senator. So I'll find an updated map and put it on the website. Next question, please. Mr. Brosiden, why is it that we are focused on Greenland for national security when we could buff our defenses in Alaska?
Here's my favorite map. Alaska is considerably far from the area that you would need to defend. Greenland is on the other side of the Arctic, and that would allow us to secure A, the entire shipping lane, and B, establish a missile defense series of batteries up in that area.
All right. Next question, please, Jared. Do any of the America First projects have a requirement that Americans must be hired? Yeah, as far as I understand, that's the idea behind a lot of these, the reindustrialization stuff. That's what the Trump administration's, it's what President Trump said when he announced this refinery project yesterday, is that it's supposed to bring American jobs. So as far as I understand, yeah, there's also been, I think a lot of people have missed this. We've reported on it. a crackdown on visa issuances, may like H-1B visas, for instance, being required to renew every year, go through full interviews every year. Now, the other visa types required to do their annual interviews that the Biden administration just kind of let slide for the entire 4 years. Those have been re-implemented. There's been more restrictions placed on different types of different ways that visas can be used and the numbers of visas. And the Trump administration has been doing a lot of this stuff pretty quietly, or at least it's not been getting a lot of attention. But we have covered some of the things they've been doing, like the immigration courts and how they're handling visas. Next question, please, Jared. Brian Edminster. While I understand that politics is the art of the possible, is there any behind-the-scenes scuttlebutt on why the SAVE Act isn't being passed? Is holding back on it a bargaining chip for something else? And if so, what? Why wouldn't election integrity be a desired thing? Is the Republican Party as compromised as this makes it seem? Why won't they represent us? Well, I think my impression of why there's resistance from Republican senators on forcing the Save America Act or the SAVE Act through with like a talking filibuster or even killing the legislative filibuster is that they wouldn't get enough votes to pass it even with a simple majority. So there has been an effort to get more senators, Republican senators, to sign on to pledge that they're going to vote for it. I think the big hangup is the mail-in ballots, because it would, on top of requiring proof of citizenship to register to vote, it would severely restrict mail-in ballots. And I think there are a lot of Republicans that still see that as actually taking away from Republican votes. That they have in some of these House districts and states, Republicans in those states view mail-in ballots as being advantageous to them. So I think that's why they don't want to do it. As far as getting rid of the legislative filibuster to do it, or even to do that and get it onto the floor for a vote, even if it fails, I think that neither Republicans nor Democrats really want to kill that. And Democrats are saying they will. They will in the future. I'm not sure how much that is a statement of intent versus red meat for the Democratic base to drive voter turnout in the 2026 and 2028 elections, because the legislative filibuster gives a lot more power to each individual senator, especially when you're talking about the shrinking majority of seats. Where if Democrats were to take the Senate, they would not get 60 seats. It gives each individual senator just a little bit more influence over what gets to the floor. I think that's a major motivator for why John Thune does not want to kill the legislative filibuster, frankly. For the Save America Act or the SAVE Act, I think there are Republicans who do not like what the Trump administration is doing with deportations. They don't want strict immigration enforcement, and that likely has to do with a combination of their own personal politics and probably donor influence. And they want they don't want the Trump administration doing worksite raids and stuff like that. I think it's a combination of incentives for some Republicans. Next question, please. From Coach SUT. Completely skipped my question, huh? I guess I know the answer. I have just heard that we have several hundred to just shy of 1,000 casualties. What have you heard? What was his previous question?
Whether or not Israel is using white phosphorus.
Oh.
And
Well,
I'm not
we couldn't
watching
even
the
tell you
Israel-Lebanon conflict.
Well, not only that, but like I don't think Israel would advertise that, so it's not like I don't have an Israeli TSSCI and sitting in on Netanyahu's briefing, so I couldn't tell you the answer to that.
Right. The far more important conflict in the region is the one between the U.S. and Iran. Territorial spats between desert states that have gone on for decades is kind of par for the course. The Strait of Hormuz is the more important one, and that's where I'm watching. As far as how many casualties we've had, first off, let's define casualties. Your casualties, colloquially, people think killed in action. That's not the only definition of a casualty. I've seen things be counted as casualties that are as little as just basically a cut seeking medical attention. Casualties can rack up quick. It would not surprise me to find out we have 1,000 casualties because there have been a lot of strikes. That does not mean that we have significantly more deaths, though. So I think that the number of reported deaths is correct so far. I think the last count I saw was 8. But there could be considerably more casualties than deaths.
Yeah, there's so much propaganda going on online right now. So if you see someone on Twitter or Facebook claiming that the U.S. is hiding 100,000 dead U.S. service members, and I've seen this said in the media, the U.S. media is colluding with the Trump administration to do this. Please take a second to think about that. Do you think the Trump administration will be able to hide 100 dead service members from the New York Times? Do you think the Washington Post wouldn't parade 10 dead U.S. service members across the front page to get at the Trump administration? Like, just take a second to think about that. And then if you see videos of, Iranian missiles striking U.S. Navy vessels, put it in full screen mode and make sure it's not from a video game, please. I've seen so much of this over the last week of people saying, well, the U.S. is hiding 250,000 dead U.S. service members, and like the Iran is has sunk 20 U.S. Navy ships, and then they'll put up a video from like Arma or some other video game that of like missile striking a battleship or something like that on Twitter. No, you are there's an information environment that exists right now of people likely with foreign incentives or foreign influence putting out information to get people to believe that somehow Iran is defeating the U.S. Navy in the Persian Gulf and in the just outside the Strait of Hormuz. This just not the Trump administration will not be able to hide that, frankly. And you should just think about what they're saying, and see if it passes even the reasonable person standard. Frankly, if somebody says there's 1,000 U.S. casualties implying deaths killed in action, and the Trump administration is hiding it, go look at the New York Times front page and see if that's being published, because it's not. You can just assume it's not true.
Yeah. Not to mention, let's consider what the reaction would be. Let's say Iran does take out a destroyer, truly sinks one, kills everybody on board. You're talking about 350 deaths right off the bat. Is the Trump administration not going to use that to then escalate the war? The Trump administration also has an incentive to publish higher casualty numbers if it wants to escalate. It can do that. It will do that. And Lisa actually brings up a great thing that I was also going to bring up. Don't forget about AI generated propaganda. The Iranians put out something very similar to that. They were saying that the Abraham Lincoln Strike Group was in the Persian Gulf, and the video showed them being able to be seen from shore and then taken out by a handful of anti-ship missiles and sank in the Persian Gulf. If you have never been in the Persian Gulf, you would know how ridiculous that entire scene I just described is. The Abe hasn't been in the Persian Gulf this entire operation. They've been in the Arabian Sea. B, they're not going to operate where they're visible from shore. That's 12 miles. They're going to be much farther out, even in the PG. And lastly, anti-ship missiles don't sink U.S. Navy ships. We've discussed that ad nauseum. The U.S. Navy ships are so thoroughly built that even when you take off every door, cut additional holes into it, and set it out designed to be sunk. Sorry, I'm thinking SinkX. Designed to be sunk, they still need to be hit with torpedoes to sink. You're not sinking these things. Have I been there? Yes, I have been to the Persian Gulf more than a few times.
Trump could not publish higher casualties. Do you think that the U.S. media would help the U.S. media that is publishing daily stories trying to undermine the Trump administration, stories that they view that they, are phrasing them in ways that are meant to undermine the legitimacy of the Trump administration. Do you think they would help the Trump administration hide a single U.S. service member death when they're publishing stories about how the Trump administration is splurging on steak and lobster for U.S. troops ahead of operations and like framing that as wasteful spending?
Yeah.
Honestly, get a grip, dude.
Yeah. All right.
And it's okay. So here's a related question that is actually, I think, a very important question from Armored Ghost. How do you see AI affecting propaganda, intelligence, and counterintelligence? Well, about 2 years ago, I forget who I talked to that asked this question. It was someone from a think tank or something like that. And my answer was that as AI, especially video AI, becomes more and image AI becomes more capable, I think it's going to be very disruptive politically. Right now, the capabilities of video and image AI, you can still tell, for the most part, 99% of the time, you can still tell that it is AI. But I think it's going to make the information environment that you live in much more treacherous in the long run, as the capability to generate video that looks realistic increases. And it has increased significantly in the last few years by leaps and bounds. It is going to make that global information environment much more treacherous. And I think more people are going to have to begin relying on basically personal networks of experts, people with domain expertise who understand what's actually happening in reality, because they will, especially social media, will become much more inundated with this type of stuff.
To that point, that relying on experts that you actually trust, you have to know people that have real operational knowledge of what this is. Part of the reason that the AI video of the Abraham Lincoln being shot was effective was that, yeah, it looked real enough. But if you didn't have any idea about how absurd the content of the video was, you may not have picked up on, hey, there's no way this is true. There's simply no way. The U.S. Navy does not operate in that fashion.
All right. Do we have any more questions coming up from Mrs. 70s? Do you think Kim may trade some of his nuclear technologies to Iran right now?
No. That is going to be a very hot button issue for everybody around the world. If you have nuclear weapons, proliferation, particularly to Iran right now, is not going to go well. The U.S. is likely going to catch it. Not to mention Kim speaking on the leader of North Korea. He does not seem like he's preparing for any kind of additional action. He did just launch a destroyer with the ability to carry a strategic missile, basically a nuclear missile. That said, you have to keep in mind that nuclear weapons tend to be defensive and not offensive. You use them as a last resort, even in North Korea. And it is a single one. He is preparing to modernize his military, not necessarily to conduct action. And that doesn't even begin to get into the relationship that South Korea has with North Korea. They're considering trying to set up another meeting between Kim and Trump. Kim is not incentivized right now to have any kind of participation in the Iran war. None.
All right. Did we have any more questions come in, Jared?
Yeah, I thought I saw one more.
Well, I did. So this is a follow-up to Frozen Nomad's question. I saw he made a comment about it's scary that the far left thinks in the long term. And I think this is also related to Ben's questions about the SAVE Act. So Exit Group, they put out an essay. Basically, they're examining why, when you're talking politics in the United States, why on the left they're much more successful at getting political projects completed, and on the right, which would be right of center, that entire spectrum, why they are not. And I think this ties into why the far left is perceived as having the ability to think on longer timelines when it comes to political projects. And their argument in this essay is that people on the right are they have a tendency to view it as wanting to be left alone, or that like we should all have this mutually agreed to system that we adhere to, and everything is all interactions are voluntary. And the left views politics in likely a more accurate way, that there is force involved in politics, not necessarily like direct action, direct force, but coercion. And basically, if you want to be left alone, there's an implication there that you need to have the political power to force people who disagree with you to leave you alone. And there really, I think it's about a mindset. There are, I think, a lot of people on the right who view you building and wielding political power as inherently immoral, and a lot of people on the left do not view it that way. I think that's why it's easier for the left more broadly to organize in this way, and they are able to engage in longer term political projects, because people who find themselves on the right, they tend to have a view of politics and the force involved behind political power as inherently immoral. And that has allowed the left more broadly to be successful politically over the right, especially when it comes to organizing. What can change that? I'm not sure. The exit group's argument is you have to think about the mindset you take towards politics. You yourself can make the decision to abstain from building and wielding political power, but in their view, you have to think about it as you're making that decision for your children, and is it moral to make that decision for them to abstain from political power because you see the use of it as immoral? I do think that it's getting at what is really holding back conservative political organizing, and some of that has started to change in the last couple of years. Charlie Kirk, for example, over at TPUSA, started becoming much more active in organizing politically at the local and state level, and getting involved in building political power on the right. Unfortunately, that was cut short, but he did seem to be on a trajectory to change some of the thinking around political organizing. All right. Do we have any more questions come in, Jared?
No.
All right. Well, if that's the end of our questions, that's also the end of our show today.
Oh, wait.
Last second.
Under the wire.
At Robert Cook, is your argument the reason Virginia Democrats are trying to disarm the right? Do you mean I'm gonna need a little more clarification on that. What about, are you asking if the idea that people who are conservative find wielding political power immoral is why Virginia Democrats are trying to disarm the right? I think this is really one of the shortfalls, because Jared and I actually talked about this after the show a couple of weeks ago, when Abigail Spanberger went from kitchen table issues to Project 2029 at the drop of a hat. What year was it? 2022 or 2021, when like 20,000 gun owners showed up to the Virginia Capitol to protest.
That was 2020. It was right before
2020.
Yeah.
Well, you asked me like, well, could they do that again? And I said, sure, but I don't think it matters. What would actually be much more impactful if those 20,000 pro Second Amendment protesters put together their own, let's say, pro ICE rapid response group or some other type of political organization. If those 20,000 people got together and created an organization to start running in local city council races and county board races and school board races and winning seats, that would be much more impactful in Virginia than those same 20,000 people showing up for 2 hours at the state capitol to protest. And because people will look at what the left does when it comes to protests and demonstrations and stuff like that and say, why don't we emulate them? Well, sure, but you should also emulate the other things they're doing, because they are, in addition to doing demonstrations and protests, they are running candidates in city council elections. They're running candidates in county board elections and state seats. We've reported on it multiple times that the DSA and PSL have been running more candidates in city council races all across the country and taking local offices. So they're not just showing up to do, no Kings protest or hands off protest. They are running for office. So there are things you can emulate there, like going out and volunteering for campaigns, or for like getting involved with organizations that are running local candidates that align with your political values, because that's what the left is doing. All right. Did we have any other questions come in, Jared?
No, now for real, we're at an hour and 6. We got to cut it anyway.
All right. Well, that is the end of our show today. We'll be back with you tomorrow in your inbox and on the show at 08 Central. Have a good rest of your day and stay out front.